In the years before the war, the students of Vault-Tec University were hard at work, learning the skills that would allow them to serve as staff in the 100+ vaults across the United States. As many were working through accelerated programs, free time was a precious commodity. While most of the student body used their free time for recreation, a group of honors chemistry students had a different plan. Not content with simply excelling in academics, these students created a brewery and a speakeasy for an alluring and incredibly intoxicating beverage. I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is the story of the Nukashine Initiative. Formed through the purchase of West Virginia University in 2031, Vault-Tec University brought many new students and strong economic growth to Morgantown. The university had a thriving Greek society, with organizations that ranged from Pi Kappa Mu, with its motto of Party Every Day, to Eta Psi Epsilon Tau, with its membership requirements of maintaining a high GPA and performing community outreach. The members of Eta Psi Epsilon Tau were generally disliked by the less academically gifted students on campus, especially the members of Pi Kappa Mu. Whatever the cause of the enmity, it led the Et-Pets, as they were known, to be the target of many pranks and derision. One of these Et-Pets was a brilliant chemistry major named Lewis. Though his brilliance came with some annoying and mockable idiosyncrasies, his academic prowess made him a perfect fit for Eta Psi Epsilon Tau. Aside from his studies, Lewis was a self-proclaimed Nuka-Cola aficionado, and he would visit the nearby Kanawut Nuka-Cola plant to try the latest flavors of his favorite beverage. He showed his love for the soda by collecting all the Nuka-Cola merchandise he could. By November 2076, his collection of Nuka-Cola memorabilia had grown to the level that he would need to rent more storage space if he was going to continue collecting. He decided that he would rent a warehouse, but he lacked the funds required. Thus, he came up with a plan. He was surrounded by alcohol-loving college students, the perfect market for a highly alcoholic beverage that he could base in his beloved Nuka-Cola. Lewis knew that his efforts and resources alone weren't going to be enough to get his plans off the ground. Thus, he engaged Judy Lowell, the head of Eta Psi Epsilon Tau, in a project they would dub the Nukashine Initiative. In the garage of the frat house, Lewis constructed an experimental brewery. Along with this, Judy also gave Lewis exclusive use of one of the bedrooms so that he could use it to think and plan. Lewis immediately enveloped the space in all things Nuka-Cola. Soon after, he concocted the first formula for Nukashine and brewed a batch. The beverage was a hit, so much so that it became clear that this version of the operation wasn't going to work long term. Just as Lewis had started this project out of the need for more space, there wasn't enough room to properly operate a brewery within the frat house. Lewis and Judy searched Morgantown for a better spot for the operation and found it at Big Al's Tattoo Parlor. Though Lewis hadn't been able to afford to rent space, the fraternity could, and Alice Big Al Lovelace was thrilled to rent space to the Et-Pets. Her business had been struggling for years. The parlor's best efforts at advertising had come to nothing. The Et-Pets signed a 10-year deal with Big Al, income that would allow her to retire. Judy and Lewis split the basement space into two areas, a brewery and a speakeasy that would serve Lewis's beverage alongside other drinks. They assembled the brewery, and Lewis resumed his work. He wasn't content with this first iteration of Nukashine, and he began working on a better formula. This work brought a new member to the initiative. One morning, as Judy came into the Nukashine to check on the progress, she entered the darkened brewery and came face to face with a single giant eyeball and floating brain. She sprinted home and banged on Lewis's door, demanding answers. His response? A note slipped onto the door saying, "Need drink tester." Judy looked into the matter a little deeper and learned that Lewis's mother worked for General Atomics, in a position where she had the requisite pull to provide her son with a robo-brain. Robo-brains contain an actual human brain, so this procurement was no mean feat. Though Judy was worried that Lewis was potentially getting them into some legal trouble, she went along with the plan. They named the robo-brain Bevy Ridge, and the work continued. Judy did what she could to keep this development quiet, telling the other Et-Pets not to tell anyone about Bev. In the end, Bevy Ridge paid off, and Lewis was able to refine his formula for Nukashine. Lewis had procured a supply of Nuka-Cola Quantum, and he replaced the plain old Nuka-Cola base with this new fluorescent blue soda. This improved formula drove increased sales to the point where the brewery couldn't keep up with the orders. This led Lewis to design and build a flash fermenter that could rapidly replenish their stock, assuming it didn't explode as it was prone to do. As word of the Nukashine Initiative spread, students began to beat a path for Eta Psi Epsilon Tau, hoping to join up just to be a part of the initiative. Judy had to find space for all these new pledges, and that's when she saw Lewis's personal space for the first time. Coming to the realization that Lewis was using this valuable real estate to support his obsession with Nuka-Cola, she left him a note suggesting that they needed his room for new pledges. Ironic, considering that he had the room in order to make the initiative successful, and now that the initiative was successful, he was facing losing it. Though up to this point in the story, it may seem like Lewis and Judy were the only productive members of the initiative, they were simply the most productive. While Lewis was undoubtedly the brains behind Nukashine itself, the rest of the project was a product of the entire fraternity. The Etpets cleaned up the basement of the tattoo parlor and installed furniture. They installed a special Nuka-Cola machine that obscured the entrance. They designed a label for the bottles. As the success of Nukashine had grown, Judy Lowell began to have some serious concerns. It wasn't simple fear that she had been breaking some college rules or even permitting laws. This was something deeper. Though they'd been instrumental in setting up the speakeasy, Judy decided to ban any Etpets other than Lewis or herself from entering the brewery supply room. She had already told them to conceal the presence of Bevy Ridge from outsiders. This was something bigger. She had discovered a secret ingredient that Lewis had been adding to the brew to give it that special kick, and she couldn't have that information getting out. As the popularity of Nukashine grew, so too did her concerns. In October 2077, these concerns compounded when Judy received an invitation to the biggest frat party of the year, the Pi Mu's Wild Eviction Party. While the Etpets had been excelling academically and building a profitable business, the Pi Mu's were partying every day, vandalizing school property, and violating every code they could. In August 2077, they had even cut the head off the university's Vault Boy statue and were prominently displaying it in their house. By September, a reckoning was at hand. Ted Dorfman, the head of Pi Kappa Mu, explained to his fellow Pi Mu's that he had a foolproof legal plan to beat the eviction. Unfortunately for the Pi Mu's, Ted Dorfman was fairly dim-witted and lazy. The Pi Mu's didn't have a legal leg to stand on, but that didn't stop them from partying every day for the time being. To mock the university, the brothers decided to host a wild eviction party on Sunday, October 17, 2077. For this party, they wanted the booze everyone was buzzing about. They wanted Nukashine. Because of their constant harassment of the Etpets and Lewis in particular, the Pi Mu's had yet to receive an invitation to the Nukashine speakeasy, so they could only go off the rumors they'd heard. Ted Dorfman finally managed to get his brothers to stop harassing the Etpets long enough that he secured a shipment of the beverage for their party. This development had Judy Lowell feeling apprehensive and thrilled. She was the head of a fraternity that had always been the underdogs, the losers. Through the Nukashine Initiative, she and Lewis had brought the Etpets to the top of the school's social scene. Unfortunately, Nukashine's allure and mystique hid a horrible secret. Lewis had been making Nukashine with nuclear waste. Even before he replaced regular Nuka-Cola with strontium-laced Nuka-Cola Quantum, he'd been adding this dangerous substance to the brew. If the truth came out, everything would come crashing down. Not just for Judy and for Lewis, but for the entire fraternity. She had used fraternity funds to rent the basement for the initiative. The initiative was the force behind their burgeoning signups. Her brothers and sisters had been putting their own efforts into building and maintaining the Nukashine speakeasy. They were all culpable of the consequences of her decisions and Lewis's actions. Judy didn't know a way out. She felt she had to continue to play her role. In the end, the Pi Mu's Wild Eviction Party was a rager, and the catalyst for the final eviction notice that the Pi Mu's received the following Wednesday. That Friday, October 22nd, 2077, everyone was partying, even the soon-to-be homeless Pi Mu's. To celebrate the success of Nukashine, Judy broke out the confetti, balloons, and streamers. At the Pi Mu house, they finished the evening with a round of Nukashine. They forced 2 of the new pledges into the utility room in the basement, handcuffed them to a pipe, and locked them in. The following morning, the hungover students of Morgantown were awakened by the screaming of the civil defense sirens. Though the city was spared a direct strike, radioactive fallout began to blow in from the Midwest. The Pi Mu house was a scene of death. In the basement, one of the handcuffed pledges had watched as his fellow pledge died. hearing the death rattles of the other members of the fraternity through the walls. There was no way out of the handcuffs, and no one to come to his aid. He found a hacksaw, but he discovered to his chagrin that it wasn't sharp enough to cut through the handcuffs or through the pipe that he was bound to. In his desperation, he cut off his own hand, but sadly, he bled out before he could get help. In the end, the nukes served to wipe away the sins of the past. Lewis and Judy never faced justice for their radioactive Nukashine. The Paimus were never evicted by the university. Over the coming days, Morgantown became a war zone, as the survivors who remained on the surface battled for the remaining radiation drugs. Once they were dead or had moved on, it would be 5 years until the city would see a substantial population again. In 2102, the former residents of Vault 76 picked through the ruins of Morgantown, rediscovering Nukashine and the recipe to make it. Somehow, knowing the contents has not deterred those who survived the bombs from imbibing this glowing blue, radioactive, highly alcoholic, blackout-inducing beverage. Alright, well that just about covers the story of the Nukashine Initiative, but I have a few more things to say before closing things out. Let me start by saying this video is a remake, remaster, upgrade of my original video on the topic. My original video on this topic was in fact my first published lore video, released July 13th, 2019. At the time, I knew I wanted to make Fallout lore videos, but I wasn't sure how I wanted those videos structured. The original video is actually a full quest walkthrough, an explanation of the brewing system, and finally a detailing of the lore, including potential contradictions. I didn't fully stumble onto the narrative style I've chosen until my lore video covering Lewisburg released 7 months later, February 11th, 2022. I decided to remake the videos released before that time and to place the originals in a separate playlist. To that end, I've already remade the Darius Angler and Sunday Brothers lore videos. With that said, onto notes specific to this video. Let's start with how I constructed the narrative here. Most of my lore videos require a certain amount of connecting raw lore with educated guesses, but this content was much more complex than that. This content required more of the process I had to use in making my Flatwoods lore video. In both of these cases, we're dealing with lore that has to be assembled like a house of cards, rather than as a simple first this, then that sort of a timeline. This is largely because there are few solid dates given in this content. In fact, the only specific dates we have are November 20th, 2076, the date Lewis originally conceived his plans for Nukashine, and October 20th, 2077, the date of the final eviction notice for the Paimus. In less specific dates, we have the month of the theft of the Vault Boy statue's head, August, and the month of the original eviction letters, September. Outside of that, everything is simply a series of loosely chained events. This lack of specific dates means that I had to place undated materials in the order that made the most sense. I'm hesitant to go too deeply into my past misunderstandings, as I fear it would muddle the interpretation of events I shared just now, but I'm going to mention a few of my old misconceptions and some of my considerations. A. I originally thought that Nukashine started out being made with Nuka-Cola Quantum. I now believe that this was a later addition. Because of that misconception, I thought that Nukashine was formulated somewhere in mid to late 2077. Originally, I didn't consider that creating the formula may have been an iterative process. B. I originally thought that Lewis was working out of the frat house garage for a lot longer. I thought that Judy telling him, quote, "We could really use this space for pledges," unquote, was saying that they needed to move the brewing equipment. I've now come to the conclusion that she wanted the bedroom back that they'd given him for his sole use. They could have fit 4 pledges into his room. C. I originally thought that Judy was referring to the nuclear waste when she told the Etpets about the, quote, secret ingredient, unquote, in Nukashine. I now think this was more likely a reference to Nuka-Cola Quantum. I don't think she would have even hinted at what Lewis was up to with nuclear waste. Because I originally considered this, quote, secret ingredient, unquote, to be nuclear waste, I didn't see this as an open slot into which Nuka-Cola Quantum easily slid. That being said, I still had to justify Judy sealing the supply room later in the process. She did that because the supply room was full of nuclear waste. It's clear to me that she didn't initially know that Lewis was using nuclear waste in the brew. When they were only producing the first runs of Nukashine at the frat house, they didn't need that much waste. Lewis could have easily hidden the volume required at that time. I think that as the volume of Nukashine they were selling increased, Lewis had to secure a larger supply of nuclear waste, and thus he filled the supply room with drums of waste. It was when Judy saw these drums of nuclear waste that she finally realized what Lewis was doing, and it was at that time that she sealed the supply room. D, and this is a big one here, there is a series of visuals and pieces of raw lore that really don't fit together well here. These all surround the Pi Mu's wild eviction party. To start, the dead bodies in the house and the holotape final initiation make it seem as though the party immediately predated the war, as in the night before they were partying. The problem with this lies in the day of the party on the poster and the date that the final eviction notice was delivered. The poster says, "This Sunday." The world ended on a Saturday. The final eviction notice came on the Wednesday before the bombs. This means that the latest the wild eviction party could have come was on Sunday, October 17th, 2077. If the Pi Mu's were all dead after that party, the university surely would have seen the corpses when they came to deliver the eviction notice. They would have called the cops. This means that the wild eviction party was not the cause of these deaths. So what was the cause? To be completely transparent, I don't know. From the holotape final initiation, it appears that everyone who drank a cup of Nukashine later died. This doesn't add up. First of all, these are hard drinking partiers. They would surely have had a high tolerance for alcohol. As players, we can consume a full growler of Nukashine without dying. Sure, we black out, but we don't die. I had been considering that maybe it was too high in alcohol content for the partiers and they'd suffered from alcohol poisoning, suffocating on their own vomit in their sleep or something like that, but these bodies are positioned in a manner that definitely doesn't match this assumption. Beyond this, I considered that the radioactive waste may have killed them. While consuming nuclear waste is extremely harmful, we again have to look at how the player responds to drinking Nukashine. Beyond this party was not the first appearance of Nukashine. The reason the Pi Mu's wanted it for their party was because it was so popular. How could the Pi Mu's have died less than a week after drinking Nukashine for the first time when we don't know of anyone else who did? So what did happen? As I stated in my narrative, I believe that right before the bombs, regardless of the eviction notice, the Pi Mu's partied. I believe that they served Nukashine either from the original batch or purchased from the speakeasy. I believe that most of the people in the house then suffered whatever death is responsible for the many other pre-war skeletons Bethesda places around the Fallout worlds that they build. Don't get me wrong, there are places where one would definitely expect to find the skeletons of the former residents, but there are also many places where bodies show up where it doesn't make any logical sense, but it does tell us the story of that location. This whole situation is further confused when we consider the testimony of the pledge who died bleeding out in the basement. The pledge says, quote, "Everyone was fine at first, well, until they weren't. That sound, I'll never forget that damned sound," unquote. I don't know what he's talking about here. I've speculated that this was the sound of the sirens or of the bombs. I've also considered that it was the sound of his fellows dying. The only other cause I've considered here is that the Nukashine delivered to the Pi Mu's that Friday may have been poisoned. This version of things does make some sense when the only person to survive is the pledge who surreptitiously threw out his Nukashine. This version of things serves to raise more questions though. Who would have poisoned them and why? The Etpets and the Pi Mu's were on better terms. The Pi Mu's did make a mockery of Lewis, but they'd been kinder to him to get their hands on the Nukashine. Aside from the circumstantial evidence, this possibility is completely unsupported. Back to the other topics though. Second, the Nukashine recipe is odd for a few reasons, starting with the fact that there's wood for fuel as part of the recipe. Natural gas tanks are plentiful in Appalachia, and while there was a shortage of gasoline before the bombs, natural gas still seems to have been common. Beyond the cooking fuel, there are some other odd ingredients in Nukashine, including razor grain and Nuka-Cola Quantum. In the past, I considered boiled water to be a strange ingredient as well, but there are definitely instances of impure tap water in the Fallout universe. While I also considered that boiling is an important part of the brewing process, it's also important that the water be pure at the start of the brewing process. That said, razor grain is a post-war mutated grain that at one point was something like wheat or barley. The fact that it's included in a pre-war recipe makes no sense. Along with that, the labels on Nukashine list its original creation in 2076. Nuka-Cola Quantum wasn't released to the public until late 2077. I've reconciled this with the conclusion that the recipe is iterative, and that while the original recipe was created in 2076, it was updated to include Nuka-Cola Quantum when that was released in 2077. That said, while it doesn't make sense from a lore perspective, it's clearly the case that the recipe containing things like razor grain makes sense for a post-apocalyptic recipe that we can use. Third, the Nukashine Initiative was doomed to failure from the start. In the past, I believed that the addition of nuclear waste to the recipe would be enough to eventually get them shut down for violating health and safety codes, but I've come to realize that that view is born out of living in our universe. In the Fallout universe, the Nuka-Cola Corporation itself was adding strontium to Nuka-Cola Quantum. While they claim it isn't harmful, I have trouble believing that it's healthy to consume a radioactive isotope that continues to glow as it passes through your system. Aside from the strontium, they also add other crazy chemicals to other varieties of Nuka-Cola, like dextromethamphetamine, so it's hard for me to see the FDA cracking down on the Nukashine Initiative for adding radioactive waste to their brew. Really, the fact that they used the prefix Nuka on the name Nukashine is what would get them sued into oblivion. Violating the trademark of the Nuka-Cola Corporation would be what would bring them down. There's no way that John Caleb Bradburton would allow this to continue. Eventually, the actions of the Nukashine Initiative would bring down all those involved, with the possible exception of Lewis. Because of Lewis's familial connections to the pre-war elite, I think he would have likely been given a slap on the wrist. Fourth, I have a few thoughts on the assignment of blame for what happened here. I'll just give an edited version of my original opinion, as it still holds. Lewis does not hold exclusive blame for the Nukashine debacle, as Judy Lowell was absolutely a part of the problem. I don't blame her to the extent that I do Lewis though, as she seems to have been swept up in the current of Nukashine, and to me, it seems that she didn't know a way out. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but for the first time, her pets were the top dogs, the ones in power. The new pledges were joining and investing their time in something that she had championed, and it had spun completely out of control. Lewis was willing to ruin the lives of those around him and potentially kill his customers for the sake of making a buck. While I generally don't support the end justifying the means argument, he doesn't even have that on his side here, as he was planning on using this money to fund an obsession with soda. While Judy cannot be said to be as guilty as Lewis from the jump, once she knew that Lewis was making his magnum opus with nuclear waste, she had an obligation to step forward and stop it. Fifth, while this content is not specifically about Vault-Tec University, I want to note that it appears that Vault-Tec University's founding date rewrites non-canonical material from the Fallout Bible. I say this because, while Fallout University was founded in 2031, the Fallout Bible says that Project Safehouse, the government program meant to construct vaults, wasn't enacted until 2054. This would mean that VTU was set up by Vault-Tec 23 years before the corporation had a reason to be created. Though I said it at the beginning of this, I'll say it again. This is rewriting non-canonical material from the Fallout Bible, which is not one of the sources of lore considered to be canonical by Bethesda. In the end, the 2031 founding date of VTU means that Vault-Tec itself must have existed before 2031. Sixth, if Lewis had been alive 200 years later, or she had been alive 200 years earlier, I think Lewis and Sierra Petrovita would have been great friends or great rivals. While Sierra is a Nuka-Cola fanatic, she seems far too innocent to knowingly harm people to fund her lifestyle. Seventh, Lewis's flash fermenter is a perfect encapsulation of most Fallout universe technology. Incredibly impressive with a massive flaw. This equipment is able to flash ferment a beverage, but is also prone to instantaneous self-destruction. Eighth, Lewis's feedback form at the Nuka-Cola plant is ridiculous. He provides grades with immeasurable levels of accuracy, particularly in his overall take on the drink, which he provides with an accuracy in the 10,000ths. Alright, I think that'll do it for the story of the Nukashine Initiative. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. When I have time, I've been streaming on YouTube lately. I'm currently streaming on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and Saturday afternoons when I can, so if you're interested, come and check it out. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios, Brian, and Real76 for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.